This isn't the Rome you've seen in movies. No golden goblets filled with wine. No roasted peacocks on silver platters. No marble halls echoing with laughter and excess. This is the real Rome. The Rome that conquered the known world one meal at a time. For centuries, Hollywood has fed us lies about Roman military life. We've been shown gleaming soldiers feasting on elaborate banquets between battles, their armor spotless, their tables overflowing with exotic delicacies. But the truth? The truth is far more shocking, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating. Picture this. It's 58 BCE. Caesar's legions are deep in Gaul, surrounded by hostile tribes cut off from supply lines. The men haven't seen fresh bread in weeks. Their last piece of salted pork was consumed 3 days ago. Rain has turned their camp into a muddy nightmare, and the enemy grows bolder with each passing hour. What do you think these legendary warriors are eating tonight? The answer will surprise you. It will humble you. And it will reveal the shocking truth about how an empire was truly built. Because while Rome's enemies were starving, while barbarian armies collapsed under the weight of hunger and poor logistics, Roman soldiers were innovating, they were adapting, they were turning desperation into discipline, scarcity into strategy. They were cooking their way to conquest. So what did the men who conquered the known world actually eat when everything was on the line? Close your eyes and imagine the Roman Empire at its peak. What do you see? Marble columns reaching toward the heavens, emperors draped in purple silk, golden chariots racing through cheering crowds. And yes, those legendary feasts, tables groaning under the weight of roasted game, exotic fruits, and rivers of wine. This is the Rome of Gladiator, the Rome of Spartacus, the Rome that has captured our imaginations for generations. But step outside those palace walls, march beyond the comfortable boundaries of the capital. Follow the dusty roads that stretch from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Here, in the mud and blood of conquest, you'll discover a different Rome entirely. The Roman legionnaire, the backbone of the greatest military machine in ancient history, lived in a world where a single grain of wheat was more precious than silver, where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to who could make their rations last longest, where cooking wasn't an art, it was survival. While emperors dined on flamingo tongues and honeyed wine, their soldiers were grinding barley between stones, mixing ash with flour to make it last longer, and turning water, vinegar, and whatever scraps they could find into something resembling a meal. The contrast is staggering. In Rome itself, wealthy citizens would vomit between courses to make room for more delicacies. Meanwhile, on the frontier, soldiers would boil leather strips just to have something to chew on during the long watches of the night. Yet somehow these hungry, desperate men built an empire that lasted 1,000 years. How is that possible? How did soldiers eating gruel from dirty helmets manage to conquer civilizations that should have crushed them? But what exactly made up these rations that fueled Rome's unstoppable war machine? Dawn breaks over a Roman military camp. 8,000 men are stirring to life, and with them comes a sound that defined the empire, the rhythmic grinding of grain. Every morning, in every Roman camp, across every frontier, soldiers would begin their day the same way. They would take their ration of barley or wheat, about 2 pounds per man, and transform it into the meal that would keep them alive for the next 24 hours. This was pulse, and it was everything. Pulse wasn't bread as we know it. It wasn't even close. It was a thick, porridge-like mixture that could be eaten hot or cold, thick or thin, depending on circumstances. To modern palates, it would taste like disappointment mixed with desperation. But to Roman soldiers, it was life itself. The process was almost ritualistic. First, the grain had to be ground. Soldiers carried small hand mills called querns, portable devices that could turn raw grain into coarse flour even in the middle of a forced march. The sound of these mills grinding became the heartbeat of the Roman army, a constant reminder that the empire ran on organization and preparation. Next came the cooking. If they were lucky enough to have proper cooking pots, the flour would be mixed with water, sometimes wine if supplies were good, and cooked into a thick paste. But luck was a luxury few soldiers could afford. More often, they would use whatever was available. Shields turned upside down over fires, helmets commandeered as cooking vessels, or flat stones heated by flames. The result was barely recognizable as food by today's standards. But Poles had a secret weapon: adaptability. When times were good, soldiers would add cheese, vegetables, or even small pieces of meat to their porridge. Olive oil, when available, would transform the gray mush into something approaching palatable. But when times were hard, and they were often hard, Poles could be stretched, diluted, and rationed to last far longer than any other food source. A handful of grain could become a full meal with enough water and creativity. Archaeological evidence from Roman camps across Europe reveals the true extent of this grain-based empire. Millstones worn smooth by countless hands, storage pits that once held thousands of pounds of wheat and barley, even ancient recipes scratched into pottery shards, showing how soldiers tried to make their daily pulls less monotonous. This wasn't just sustenance, it was strategy. While their enemies relied on hunting, foraging, or complex supply chains that could easily be disrupted, Roman soldiers carried their entire food production system on their backs. They were mobile, self-sufficient, and virtually unstoppable. But man cannot live on porridge alone. So what else kept the legions fighting? The smell hits you first. Smoke and salt and something indefinably ancient. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Roman camp, while most soldiers are still grinding their morning grain, the specialists are already at work. These are the men responsible for the empire's protein, the ones who transform living animals into preserved rations that can survive months on the march without spoiling. They work with knives worn thin by use, salt precious as gold, and techniques passed down through generations of warfare. Meat, for the Roman soldier, was never guaranteed. Unlike grain, which could be calculated, rationed, and distributed with mathematical precision, protein was opportunity. A successful raid might yield cattle or sheep. A friendly local population might trade pigs for protection. Sometimes, if they were very lucky, soldiers could hunt wild game in the territories they occupied. But fresh meat was a luxury that few armies could afford to depend on. By the time word reached the quartermaster that animals were available, by the time the beasts were slaughtered and distributed among thousands of men, spoilage would have claimed most of the bounty. So Rome developed something far more sophisticated, a preservation industry that could turn a single pig into months of protein for dozens of soldiers. The process began with salt, tons of it, shipped from mines across the empire at enormous expense. Roman armies consumed salt at rates that would seem impossible today, not for seasoning, but for survival. Every piece of meat had to be packed in salt immediately after slaughter, drawing out moisture and creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. But salting was just the beginning. Roman soldiers became masters of smoking, using whatever wood was available to create dense preservation-grade smoke that could penetrate deep into meat fibers. They learned to slice meat paper-thin so it would dry faster and last longer. They discovered that fat, properly rendered and stored, could preserve other foods and provide crucial calories during lean times. The crown jewel of Roman military preservation was laridum, a type of bacon that could last for months without refrigeration. Unlike modern bacon, laredum was lean, heavily salted, and smoked until it became almost leather-like in texture. Soldiers would shave off tiny pieces with their knives, adding it to their pulls for flavor and protein. Archaeological digs at Roman military sites have revealed the remnants of enormous smoking operations. Stone-lined pits that once held fires for days at a time. Wooden racks that supported hundreds of pounds of drying meat. Even ancient sausages preserved in the dry air of desert garrisons, still bearing the marks of the hemp strings used to bind them. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. Romans rarely ate beef. Cattle were too valuable as work animals to be routinely slaughtered for food. Instead, they relied on pork, mutton, and poultry, animals that could be raised quickly and efficiently in the territories they controlled. This wasn't just about taste preference, it was about economics, logistics, and long-term strategic thinking. Rome understood that controlling food production meant controlling populations. They didn't just conquer territory, they transformed it into a supply chain. Yet preservation wasn't just about taste, it was about strategy and even survival during siege warfare. The Siege of Alesia, 52 BCE. Vercingetorix and his Gallic warriors are trapped behind stone walls, watching Caesar's legions construct a second wall around the first, a siege within a siege. Food becomes more precious than gold. And in this crucible of desperation, the true character of Roman military cooking reveals itself. This is where myths die and legends are born. Imagine being trapped for months with no supply lines, no fresh food, and no hope of relief. Your enemies surround you on all sides. Your water is rationed to a few mouthfuls per day. The last of your normal rations disappeared weeks ago. What do you eat to survive? For Roman soldiers, the answer was everything. Archaeological evidence from siege sites across the empire tells a story that Hollywood would never dare portray. When the carefully preserved bacon ran out, soldiers turned to their leather gear. Belt straps, armor padding, even shoe leather would be boiled for hours until it became soft enough to chew, providing minimal nutrition but something to fill desperately empty stomachs. But leather was just the beginning. Roman military manuals from this period, cold, practical documents written by men who understood that siege warfare was a matter of pure endurance, describe cooking techniques that sound like recipes from hell itself. Tree bark, stripped and boiled, could provide fiber and trace nutrients. Grass and weeds, properly prepared, offered vitamins that prevented scurvy during long sieges. Even sawdust, mixed with whatever flour remained, could stretch rations for precious additional days. The most shocking discovery comes from a Roman siege site in Britain, where archaeologists found evidence of something that challenges every assumption about Roman military discipline. In the desperate final weeks of a siege, soldiers had begun hunting and cooking rats, pigeons, and even insects. These weren't barbarians. These weren't desperate refugees. These were members of the most disciplined, well-trained military force in ancient history. And when survival demanded it, they became culinary innovators of the most extreme kind. But even in these desperate circumstances, Roman military organization never broke down completely. Soldiers still shared cooking duties within their contubernium, the 8-man units that formed the basic building blocks of the legion. They still maintained fires according to regulation. They still followed protocols for food distribution, even when that food was barely recognizable as such. Perhaps most remarkably, they recorded everything. Roman military scribes, even during sieges, continued to document what was eaten, how it was prepared, and how long it lasted. These records, preserved on wooden tablets found in British bog sites, reveal a level of systematic thinking about food that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. One tablet dated to 85 CE describes a recipe for siege bread made from acorn flour, ground bone meal, and what the writer diplomatically calls available plant matter. Another details a method for making soup from fish bones and seaweed that apparently kept a garrison alive for 2 additional weeks. The message is clear. Roman soldiers didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with their minds, their creativity, and their absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances. When normal food disappeared, they invented new food. When cooking became impossible, they redefined what cooking meant. But when food wasn't scarce, the army had a system, one that turned logistics into a science. Picture the most organized kitchen you've ever seen. Now multiply that precision by 8,000 and place it in the middle of a muddy field, surrounded by enemies, with no electricity, no refrigeration, and no guarantee that supplies will arrive tomorrow. This was the Roman military kitchen, and it was a marvel of engineering that made McDonald's look like amateur hour. Every Roman army was actually 800 separate kitchens, each serving exactly 8 men. These weren't random groupings. They were carefully selected teams who would live, fight, cook, and often die together. The contubernium was more than a military unit. It was a family bound by shared meals and mutual survival. Each group of 8 had specific roles that never varied, no matter where in the empire they found themselves. One man was responsible for maintaining the cooking fire, a job that could mean the difference between hot meals and starvation if he failed. Another managed the group's water supply, including the crucial task of finding and purifying drinking water in hostile territory. The third man maintained their cooking equipment, the shared pot that served as their universe, the spoons carved from wood or bone, the cups that held their daily wine ration. The fourth was their miller, responsible for the backbreaking work of grinding grain every morning before dawn. The remaining 4 rotated through duties that included gathering fuel for fires, hunting or foraging for supplementary food, cleaning equipment, and the essential task of standing guard while others cooked. Because in Roman military thinking, being surprised while eating was not just embarrassing, it was fatal. But the real genius of the Roman military kitchen wasn't in its organization. It was in its standardization. From the beaches of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, every Roman soldier knew exactly how his meal would be prepared, when it would be served, and what his role in the process would be. Archaeological evidence from Roman camps reveals an almost obsessive level of uniformity. Cooking pots from Britain are virtually identical to those found in Romania. Fire pits in Spain follow the same construction patterns as those in Turkey. Even the spacing between cooking areas was standardized, exactly 8 feet, allowing for optimal use of space while maintaining safety distances between fires. This standardization served a crucial military purpose. When units were combined, separated, or transferred between legions, soldiers could immediately integrate into new cooking arrangements without confusion or delay. A legionnaire from the Rhine frontier could arrive at a camp in North Africa and know instantly where his cooking area would be, how it would be equipped, and what his responsibilities were. The Romans even standardized their portable equipment. Every legion carried disassembled clay ovens that could be rebuilt wherever they made camp. These weren't crude affairs. They were sophisticated bread baking systems that could produce hundreds of loaves simultaneously. Archaeological reconstructions show that a single Roman field oven could bake enough bread to feed an entire cohort for 3 days. But perhaps most impressive was their supply chain management. Roman quartermasters calculated food requirements with mathematical precision, accounting not just for basic calories, but for seasonal variations, regional preferences, and the specific nutritional needs of men engaged in heavy physical labor. Records from Hadrian's Wall show that Roman commanders tracked everything. How much grain each unit consumed per month, how long preserved meat would last in different climates, even how much firewood was required to cook a standard meal. This wasn't bureaucracy for its own sake, it was logistics as warfare. And while organization was key, Romans also developed remarkable ways to cook on the move. The column stretches to the horizon. 20,000 men, their armor glinting in the morning sun, their boots raising clouds of dust that can be seen for miles. They've been marching for 6 hours and they won't stop for another 4. But somehow, impossibly, the smell of fresh bread drifts back from the front ranks. This is Roman engineering at its most ingenious. This is an army that refused to let movement stop them from eating well. The secret weapon wasn't magic, it was portable clay ovens that could be assembled, used, and abandoned in the space of a few hours. These remarkable devices, reconstructed from archaeological fragments found across Europe, were essentially prefabricated bread factories that could travel with an army. Each oven was designed in sections small enough for a single soldier to carry without significantly adding to his load. The base, walls, and dome were all separate pieces that fitted together like a puzzle. When an army made camp, specialized soldiers could have dozens of these ovens assembled and firing within an hour. But here's the ingenious part. They weren't meant to be permanent. Roman commanders had calculated that the time and effort required to disassemble and transport ovens exceeded their value, so they built them to be disposable. After baking enough bread to last the next leg of the march, the ovens would be abandoned, left behind like discarded eggshells as the army moved on. Archaeological sites across Europe are littered with the remains of these temporary bakeries. Each one tells the same story. Romans passed this way, baked bread, and moved on. The precision is stunning. Fragments found in Britain are virtually identical to those discovered in Romania, suggesting a level of standardization that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. But ovens were just one part of Roman portable cooking technology. Soldiers became masters of improvisation, turning their equipment into cooking tools with remarkable creativity. Shields flipped upside down became perfect frying pans for cooking meat or flatbreads. The concave shape distributed heat evenly, and the bronze construction conducted heat efficiently. Helmets served as both protection and cookware. Archaeological evidence shows wear patterns on the inside of Roman helmets, consistent with their use as cooking pots. Soldiers would remove the leather liner, fill the helmet with water and ingredients, and suspend it over a fire using their javelins as a makeshift tripod. Even more remarkably, Roman soldiers learned to cook while marching. They would prepare dough before breaking camp, then carry it in their packs while it rose during the day's march. When they stopped for rest, the dough would be ready to cook on heated stones or in shallow pits dug beside the road. Archaeological excavations of Roman marching camps. The temporary fortifications built every single night during campaigns reveal sophisticated cooking installations that could be constructed and dismantled in hours. Fire pits with carefully engineered airflow systems, stone platforms that served as communal cooking surfaces, even primitive smokehouses for preserving meat acquired during the day's march. But perhaps most impressive was their water management system. Roman armies traveling through hostile territory couldn't rely on finding safe drinking water, so they developed portable purification methods that were centuries ahead of their time. They would boil water in large bronze vessels, then filter it through layers of cloth and charcoal, carried specifically for this purpose. The result was an army that could march faster, farther, and with better nutrition than any of their opponents. While barbarian warriors were stopping to hunt, forage, or negotiate with local populations for food, Roman legions were eating bread baked that morning from grain they carried themselves. But food wasn't just fuel. It carried culture, morale, and even identity across the empire. The spoon trembles slightly as the old soldier lifts it to his lips. He's 3,000 miles from Rome, stationed on a windswept frontier where wolves howl in the darkness, and the nearest civilized city is a month's march away. But in this moment, as the familiar taste of garum touches his tongue, he's home. This is the secret weapon that Hollywood never shows you. This is how Rome conquered not just territories, but hearts and minds. Flavor. While barbarian armies subsisted on whatever they could hunt or forage, Roman soldiers carried the tastes of civilization with them wherever they marched. Small clay amphorae filled with olive oil from Spain, leather pouches containing precious salt from mines in Gaul, and most importantly, tiny bottles of garum, the fermented fish sauce that transformed bland military rations into something approaching a proper Roman meal. Garum was the empire's greatest culinary export, made from fish entrails fermented in salt for months. It sounds revolting to modern palates, but to Romans it was liquid gold, a concentrated source of umami that could make even the most basic pulls taste like a feast fit for emperors. Archaeological evidence from military sites across Europe reveals just how important these flavor enhancers were to Roman military life. At Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, excavations have uncovered thousands of small containers that once held spices, sauces, and seasonings. These weren't luxury items reserved for officers. They were standard equipment that reached the lowest-ranking soldiers. But the real revelation comes from the letters soldiers wrote home, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of British bog sites. These intimate documents, written on thin wooden tablets, reveal the emotional importance of familiar tastes in maintaining morale among men stationed far from home. One letter, written by a soldier named Octavius to his brother in Rome, contains a desperate plea for good oil and garum, not the British substitute that tastes like salted mud. Another soldier writes to his wife, asking her to send proper bread yeast because the local grain makes bread that even our Gallic prisoners refuse to eat. These weren't complaints about luxury. They were expressions of cultural identity. Roman soldiers understood instinctively that maintaining their connection to Roman civilization required more than just military discipline. It required the daily ritual of familiar flavors, prepared in familiar ways, shared with fellow citizens. The most common flavor enhancer was pasca, a mixture of water, vinegar, and sometimes herbs that served as the standard drink for common soldiers. Modern reconstructions reveal that pasca was actually nutritionally sophisticated, providing vitamins and minerals that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases common in armies of the period. But pasca was more than just medicine. It was culture in a cup. The specific mixture of herbs varied by region, allowing soldiers to maintain connections to their home provinces even while stationed on distant frontiers. Soldiers from Gaul added different herbs than those from Spain or Egypt, creating subtle regional variations that reinforced unit identity and morale. Roman military commanders understood this psychology better than any generals before or since. They didn't just supply armies with calories, they supplied them with identity. Wine rations weren't just about alcohol content, they were about maintaining the Roman tradition of civilized dining. The daily distribution of olive oil wasn't just about nutrition, it was about preserving the connection to Mediterranean culture that defined Roman citizenship. The archaeological record shows that Roman armies actually carried more variety in their diet than many modern military forces. Excavations at Caerleon in Wales have revealed evidence of over 40 different spices and seasonings in use at a single military base. These ingredients came from across the known world: black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cumin from Egypt, creating a global supply chain that wouldn't be matched again until the age of exploration. And that's the real shocking truth. The Empire's greatest weapon wasn't steel, but sustenance. The final battle was won, not with swords, but with bread. As the last rays of sunlight fade over the conquered territories, as the standards of Rome are planted in yet another foreign soil, the real victory isn't measured in casualties or captured gold. It's measured in something far more profound: the ability of an army to maintain its strength, its discipline, and its cultural identity while operating thousands of miles from home. This is the shocking truth that Hollywood will never show you. Rome didn't conquer the world through superior tactics or better weapons, though they had both. Rome conquered the world by solving a problem that had defeated every empire before them: how to keep a massive army fed, healthy, and motivated, while constantly on the move. Every great military force in history has ultimately been limited by its stomach. Alexander's armies turned back from India not because they couldn't win more battles, but because they were tired, homesick, and increasingly difficult to supply. Napoleon's Grande Armée didn't fail because of Russian winter alone. It failed because the logistics of feeding hundreds of thousands of soldiers across hostile territory proved impossible to maintain. But Rome succeeded where others failed, by transforming military cooking from a necessary evil into a competitive advantage. While their enemies worried about where their next meal would come from, Roman soldiers carried their entire food system on their backs. While barbarian armies were forced to stop and forage, Roman legions marched with the certainty that they would eat well tonight, tomorrow, and for months to come. The numbers tell the story. A Roman legion could remain operational in hostile territory for up to 6 months without resupply, sustained entirely by the rations they carried and the food production systems they could establish. No other military force in ancient history came close to this level of logistical independence. But the real genius wasn't in the quantity of food. It was in the psychology of eating well. Roman commanders understood that soldiers who ate familiar food, prepared in familiar ways with familiar flavors, would fight harder and longer than hungry barbarians eating whatever they could scavenge. This wasn't just about morale. It was about cultural identity. Every time a Roman soldier ground grain in his quern, every time he added garum to his pulse, every time he shared a meal with his contubernium, he was reinforcing his connection to Roman civilization. He wasn't just a warrior fighting for distant politicians. He was a citizen of the greatest culture in human history, carrying that culture's values and traditions into the darkest corners of the world. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Wherever Rome conquered, Roman cooking techniques followed. Native populations didn't just adopt Roman laws and Roman architecture. They adopted Roman recipes, Roman preservation methods, Roman approaches to organizing food production and distribution. In Britain, France, Spain, Romania, and dozens of other modern countries, you can still trace the influence of Roman military cooking in local cuisines. Bread-making techniques that Roman soldiers taught to local populations, preservation methods that allowed communities to survive harsh winters, even specific recipes that evolved from military rations into regional specialties. Rome's empire lasted 1,000 years not because of its legions, but because of its lunchboxes. The same organizational principles that allowed 8 soldiers to share a cooking pot in the wilderness of Germania were eventually applied to governing provinces, managing trade routes, and integrating diverse populations into a single civilization. So the next time you see a movie about Roman warriors feasting on elaborate banquets, remember the real story. Remember the soldier boiling barley in his helmet while rain falls on his shoulders. Remember the 8-man team working together to grind grain before dawn in a hostile foreign land. Remember the careful measurement of precious olive oil, the shared appreciation of a bit of garum mixed into an otherwise flavorless porridge. Remember that empires aren't built by heroes eating heroic meals. They're built by ordinary men solving extraordinary problems, one spoonful at a time. The shocking truth about how Romans cooked their food in war isn't about cooking at all. It's about civilization itself, how it spreads, how it adapts, and how it survives in the most unlikely places. History hides in the smallest details: the taste of Pascha on a cold morning, the sound of grain being ground in the darkness, the smell of bread baking in a clay oven that will be abandoned tomorrow. If you want to keep uncovering the forgotten truths of Rome, the real stories behind the myths and legends, make sure you join us for the next journey into the past. Because the more we dig, the more we discover that the greatest empire in human history was built not by giants, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that's a story worth telling.